Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include shirtless George Washington, Godzilla bathroom signs, and CIA conspiracies. All this as we talk government-sponsored art on Created Things.
Hello and welcome to Created Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives, and I hope the only podcast courageous, bold, disturbing enough to be brought to you also by the Committee on Public Safety. I'm your host, Father Gabriel Toretta, medievalist, priest, Catholic dude. With me is my co-host, Jacob Flores Popcheck, artist, psychotherapist, guy with a pipe in his mouth. How are you?
I have a pipe. I have an American flag colored shirt. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day to any American listeners listening to this on the 4th of July, which is when this is going to be posted. And to all of those listening, maybe outside of the country, or maybe Americans who don't celebrate Independence Day listening. Happy Monday.
Happy absence of Dependence Day. I guess that's it. Like, I'm sorry that you can't be. I'm sorry that you can't be as dependent as you wish that you could be. But I'm sorry for the absence of dependence that you experience while the rest of us are enjoying being independent.
That would be funny if Independence Day was literally just a day to celebrate being independent.
Yeah,
You just send your parents a letter and you're like, I don't financially need you. And that's the way you celebrate.
Yeah. And this is so great. Like, and if you're a parent, you like send your 3-year-old down the street to like buy you some beer, you know?
Right.
So
there's a Japanese show that's doing that now. Are you aware of this?
I think you might have told me this before, which is probably why this is on my street.
Japanese show on Netflix where it's literally like a competition where you send your 3-year-old child to run an errand, and then a camera crew follows and watches the hilarity ensue. Which I find disturbing, but
it's Japan, you know, at this point, I mean, like, children are a novelty there, so like we gotta treat them like a novelty. It's fun. Yeah, it's cool. It's no big deal. It's also, of course, Pier Giorgio Frassati's feast day. Who is one of my favorite saints, and
the saint responsible for us meeting.
Indeed. And as an American, you never really get to commemorate his feast day because there's this, you know, in the contemporary moment, like if you open up the book that the priest says mass from, like called the Missal, pretty much all the prayers in it are for things that like you might expect if you, I don't know, if you don't know much about Christianity or whatever, you just be like, well, there's prayers to like God and stuff, and there's like the saints, and those things are kind of cool. And if you flip to the back of the book that not that many people use, then there's some prayers for like, you know, good rain, end of bad harvest, things like that. You know, it's like, okay, that seems pretty normal. But right now in the American Missal, there's also a couple of, like, you could say just like patriotism masses. So one of them is for Thanksgiving, which more or less celebrates America's manifest destiny, or at least that's how I perceive it. And then the other one is 4th of July. So it has like its own, it's, you know, it's a whole weird thing to celebrate liturgically because it's not really. Anyway, it's just a thing, but there are special prayers that you can say on the day for like Independence Day. And
so our poor boy Pier Giorgio Frassati gets ignored.
Yeah, well, only in America, but yes, he does.
Right. But that all the more reason why I am smoking this pipe. Well, not smoking, but using as a prop this
prop pipe, this pipe of props.
Although, as you pointed out, and I won't cite the company specifically, but there's some artists out there, if we can even call them that, some ding dang fascists out there, I would say, who are removing the trademark pipe from depictions of Pier Giorgio Frassati. He's always smoking a pipe and hiking the mountains. And there are people who, you know, want to ruin the party and are taking away his trademark pipe and depictions. And I say, boo to those people and shame.
Yeah, I say all the same way, like verily, verily, I say unto you, boo and shame for being ashamed of a saint whose cause you seem to be promoting while you're also ashamed of him, which is a weird combination. One of my very favorite, one of my very favorite photographs of a pope of all time is a photograph of John the 23rd. Who is about as big as a house. He's a big boy. And he just has the most gigantic belly. So you've got John the 23rd, and he's wearing his like, I forget if he's a cardinal at the time. Anyway, but like he's got a whole like robe that goes down to the floor, and then there's a really big belt, like kind of like a cummerbund, basically. And if you've got a gigantic belly, that thing just really accentuates it because it like wraps around like the center of your gigantic belly. It's not an
ideal look. No.
Yeah, it's ideal if I think it was ideal. I think it was his ideal look. This was John the 23rd being his best self. So he's there, and he's got his just ginormous belly being like accentuated by this ginormous cummerbund belt around it. And he's got the biggest smile on his face, and he's got his gesturing, and he's clearly like cracking some sort of joke to the person he's talking to. And in the hand that he's gesturing with is this big cigarette. And you just look at this man and be like, oh my gosh, this is what freedom feels like. This is how we celebrate our lack of dependence on neurotic late 20th century notions of physical morality, and just say like, this guy is fat as like 300 pounds worth of buckets of clams. And he's smoking like crazy, and he's just having a grand old time, and he's a saint, and that's awesome.
So if you're listening at home, kiddies, smoking is cool. This is an official.
Yeah, I guess the moral of the story is that like, our forefathers died on this soil so that we could celebrate the fact that smoking is cool.
There is actually some historical truth to that, kind of, because wasn't most of the whole American thing sort of founded on the ability to grow tobacco free of tax?
Tea, really, but we like tobacco too.
Component. Oh boy!
But what are you going to do?
Slavery and all that tobacco.
Listen, but we are in fact today talking, ironically, on the day in which we celebrate our country's absence of dependence. We are talking about the way in which arts can celebrate their presence of dependence upon the government, which is to say government-sponsored arts, and like what the deal is with that and how that works.
Yeah, because here's the thing about the government. They're not great at art. Like most governments are historically not terrifically concerned with beauty. They are at best concerned with the social welfare of their people. And that's rare. The majority of the time, world governments, if we're being honest with ourselves, are simply concerned with maintaining the financial bottom line and with inspiring fear in those who would seek to, rock the boat. But every once in a while, Uncle Sam dips his quill into writing some checks for artists to do some weird stuff. We often take for granted these artworks that the government sponsors. Often secretly, they sponsor these artworks in very kind of conspiratorial ways, but they're this part of our everyday existence. They're part of kind of the collective conscious of what it is to be an American. And I find them just really, really fascinating because they represent this bizarre juxtaposition between a group of people that, generally speaking, at best has no time or patience for aesthetics, and at worst actively distrusts aesthetics. And then suddenly they find a reason to either create their own aesthetics or at least contribute to the creation of aesthetics that benefit them. So I thought it might be fun to do a tight little episode today for 4th of July as people are driving to their picnics and their fireworks shows, where they could listen to some of the weirdest things their government has done in the world of art.
Yeah, I thought that's exactly right. And I have to admit, like when I think of historical governments and art, all kinds of wonderful things come to mind, like beautiful cathedrals and like beautiful statuary in like Italian piazzas and stuff like that. And I confess, if I just say to myself like government sponsored art, and I allow that to just like land with a blip in my like contemporary experience, then I think of, for instance, like the Housing and Urban Development Building in Washington, D.C., which is right next to one of our priories. And so is prominently present in my mental landscape, which looks approximately like someone decided to build Jeremy Bentham's theoretically perfect prison, the Panopticon, out of like brownish gray concrete in a single pour. And barfed it all over the juncture between like the National Mall and 395. So I think of something like that, for instance, which is, I don't exactly know how to put it, not the most inspiring example of government inspired art, although it does inspire horror and probably suicidal depression in its denizens. So I guess it does inspire something. Or I think, like, for instance, I was just thinking like, okay, well, if I say that government sponsored art, what do I think? The first thing that flashed to mind actually was, so the very first time, I think this is true, the very first time I heard anything that there was this China virus.
Maybe let's not call it that. Maybe let's just have Kyle edit that part out.
Nah, so there was this China virus, which turned out, I know, I'm saying it's a joke, but
for those who don't understand irony.
Yes, exactly. The first time I heard anything about it was that a friend of mine who is like a doctor and way on top of these things sent me a link to this thing from the CDC that was like an infographic kind of image of like a 8x5 series of different faces that was like different beard styles and whether they allowed you to wear N95 masks safely or not.
Oh gosh, yes. I think I repressed that, but I do have a phantom memory of seeing this graphic. Yeah. And
in total honesty, I think it was very, very difficult for me to think that anything that people were saying about COVID-19 was even remotely serious for like a solid month or so after that, which is to say like sort of like right before, like the day, basically until the day before things started to lock down, basically. I just assumed that this whole thing was completely frivolous
because the silliness of this graphic set a tone.
Yeah, the government's officially sponsored. I mean, it's not a high art, but like, but it is a graphic design, a graphic art, and there's something there to it. Was so extraordinarily silly that I just assumed like, oh, well, this is just basically in the no big deal category of like reasons that the man doesn't want me to wear a sweet Hulk Hogan mustache like he's always trying to stop me from doing, So I don't know. I mean, those are a couple of things. Again, I could just say like, what comes to mind right away. And I realize I'm not being fair, but I'm just saying like, these are the things that literally come to mind off the top of my head.
I think you're being fairer than because you're pointing to the inherent silliness of a lot of government sponsored artworks. Even if you agree with the political cause, right? The fact that the kind of government shadow people, what am I saying, behind it, take it so seriously, there's kind of an immediate silliness to it because the actual rendered out artwork cannot possibly match the seriousness of the message. You actually exposed me to one of the earliest versions of this that I was aware of. You mentioned, Pier Giorgio Frassati at the opening of this episode. I mentioned that's how we met. We met because you were running what was called a Frassati Fellowship, sort of a young adults group built out of the charisms that this very young saint had promoted. And one of the lectures you had done on weird art forms included, and I think I'm getting this right, I don't want to put you on the spot. You might not remember too much about it, but included this truly hilarious statue of like a Greek god, George Washington, that was sort of aggressively sexy, that had been carved out to represent like the divine nature of the founding fathers. And this was paired with, I think it was a mosaic titled The Apotheosis of George Washington, just George Washington as a Zeus-like deity. And again, like these are government-sponsored works that are being taken really, really seriously by the people promoting them, and that are just so hilarious the second you view them, outside of kind of the agenda'd vibe that created them in the first place.
Yeah, if you go into the Capitol building, and like go and look at, like, actually, if you think what's underneath the dome, well, on the underside of the big Capitol dome is a painting. This is a painting of the apotheosis of George Washington, who is just Zeusing it up like nobody's business. It's actually painted by the same painter who worked on some various aspects of Notre Dame campus, and so like painted a bunch of stuff on Notre Dame campus buildings. Anyway, he's a very talented classical artist, painter. And you just look at it and you think like, how is that possible?
This is just this jacked, shirtless George Washington wearing a toga and people worshiping him.
Just like straight up. Yeah. And being like kind of taken up into heaven / kind of reigning in heaven already, because he's like sort of #Zeus Washington.
Well, this is, apotheosis, right? He is not being kind of taken up into, that would be just theosis. That would be God saying, hey, you're so great, I'm going to bring you up into heaven. Apotheosis is, I'm bringing myself to divinity by sheer force of my own will, which, as American a concept as that is patently silly to observe in any kind of visual art form, especially when it's like a very serious government building, and there you've got the founding father in a powdered wig, shirtless in a cloud. It really sets the stage for how silly patriotism can be in its purest form. I mean, you absolutely have to have no sense of irony to not titter when you see that.
Yeah. I mean, irony is obviously playing a critical role here. Right? I've seen the image a number of times, and you just think like, I just literally don't know how to look at this painting with like non-ironic eyes, and like. Before irony became like a dominant cultural force and like a major mode of viewing like all things, I recognize that there are different ways of viewing that painting, and different like networks of meaning in which to establish it. But in an era, for better and for worse, where like many people sort of like first look at something that is very earnest and very serious, and presents that sort of, wears that earnestness and serious like very forward, is just going to be irony. You just can't do anything with it. You just can't do anything with it. Be like, it just looks silly, and that's nothing you can do about it.
Well, and I think that becomes the story of a lot of government design. That comment on your part kind of pivots me into my personal favorite example of what happens when the government gets really, really into art. So most people, there are definitely huge exceptions to this, especially when you get into the actual art world, but most average everyday people, when it comes to modern art, what's considered modern art, the Jackson Pollock type splashes of paint on a canvas, a single red dot on a huge square of white kind of things. Most people have a sort of cynical again, per what you're saying, this sort of ironic look at that says, I could do that. Like a kid could do that. A monkey could do that. Like, why is this being celebrated as art? And it turns out that there's kind of a reason for that. So this is why this is my favorite example of government sponsored design, because it actually does turn out that a lot of what we consider modern art, including the Jackson Pollock stuff, was actually funded by the CIA. That basically most people in the 40s and the 30s and stuff did view modern art the same way that most people today do, with that sort of anyone can do this mentality, and bordering even more cynically on, because this is so abstract, it's actually a threat to our values as Americans and as, in most cases, Protestant Christians with upstanding sensibilities and things like this, right? And so modern art was seen with just a real lens of distrust. And then, I want to get the exact dates right, so I'm going to pull up my notes here. But basically, what then ends up happening is that Russia decided that under Stalin, so Russia under Stalin, in 1934, decides that the only type of art that is acceptable is hyperrealism.
Yeah, this Soviet realism, it's often called. That makes sense.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And so they actually define it. They say any acceptable art has to have these four qualities. It has to be proletarian, so it has to be relevant to the workers and understandable to them. Two, it has to be typical, so scenes of everyday life of the people, so you shouldn't show anything kind of out of the ordinary at all. Realistic, it has to be, again, brutally realistic in the representational sense. And then partisan, supportive of the aims of the state and the party. So, we're talking about real hardcore propaganda here, but they're dictating stylistically what that propaganda is going to look like in a way that not a lot of other places were doing at that time. There is, whether you agree with the propaganda of any particular government, there are some objectively beautiful sort of, ink stamp kind of hat show print type propaganda posters that are being done at different points and things like this. And they just had no time or patience for that, right? They saw an actual value in the hyper realistic, which then causes the CIA over the next decade or so to go, oh, does that mean that in response, modern art is like the most American thing we could do?
Oh, no.
Because it's super expressionistic and abstract, and just like us as Americans, it don't give a shit what's going on. We don't need to represent anything. We're free. And, and then Jackson Pollock is kind of seen as this cowboy, raised on his ranch and in Wyoming, and, slinging paint and is firing a 6-shooter and everything. And so
America.
The CIA makes an active move, to rebrand modern art as the most American form of art, specifically in response to what they're trying to rebrand as the too straight-laced art of the commies. This is a quote from Donald Jameson, former CIA agent. He says, "We recognized that this was the kind of art that did not have anything to do with socialist realism. Moscow in those days was very vicious in its denunciation of any kind of nonconformity, so one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and heavy-handedly was worthy of our support."
Oh my gosh, this is so insane.
It gets so much crazier, because basically what then happens is that the Rockefellers get involved.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Yeah. Famously, the Rockefellers get involved, and they basically end up, and I'm giving a very abbreviated version of this for time, but they basically end up using the MoMA to promote modern art and expressionist art throughout the world via touring exhibitions to incite dissent among communists and communist sympathizers, with the understanding being, if they see these paintings, they will see how freewheeling they are, how freewheeling the art is, and they will want to defy their communist oppressors. And so literally the
amazing.
Literally the CIA in 1952, through the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, gives MoMA a 5-year grant to just exclusively fund directly into the pockets of guys like Jackson Pollock and promote really weird, kind of terrible modern art to spread all over the world. And this thing, and it's so effective though, because even now you go into a modern art museum, if you go into the Warhol Museum, if you go into the modern art section of whatever your local art museum is, there is this decidedly kind of leftist bent to the majority of modern art, very, very progressive. It most often associates itself ostensibly with socialist or even communist values at the most extreme end. And yet kind of the whole origins of the movement were exclusively funded, and we still hold as the major masterpieces of the movement, things that were exclusively funded by the extremely conservative, bordering on fascist CIA at a time that they were conspiratorially just trying to undermine everything we associate that art with now. And that to me is government-sponsored art in a nutshell, right? Where it's so sincere and it's so sure of its own agenda, and it, to the degree that it becomes patently silly, but also maybe ends up becoming kind of a permanent part of the collective conscious of regarding a certain medium. I don't know. The whole story is bizarre to me, and I could talk about it for hours. I wish we could do a whole episode just on that.
I mean, it's just the craziest thing, because again, you would never think of like Pollock and the Action School and stuff as like thinking them, I mean, this is putting it too strongly, but thinking of them as government shills is just sort of like outrageously hilarious, given that they were these sort of like legitimately kind of like countercultural and antisocial in a lot of ways, sort of people and stuff. And that's just hilarious.
And I do wonder like what, and I have no information on this, is purely conjecture on my part, but you do have to wonder, like, what is the thought process of a guy like Pollock when I don't know if he finds out later that that's how he's being funded, or if he knows going in that's what's funding him, or if he ever finds out. I mean,
do you really care though? I mean, do you really care?
But that's what's fascinating me, is like you have these values, and then the people who represent fundamentally the opposite of your values come in and say, we want to promote your values, but for the opposite of why you want to promote them. Like, how do you justify the cognitive dissonance of that?
Yeah, but I'm maybe it works.
As an artist, I'm fascinated by
totally. That. Yeah, totally. Maybe kind of works anyway, There's this movie by I always forget his name. He's an Austrian director who he directed The Lives of Others, which is just a phenomenal movie. And he did this other movie relatively recently called Werk ohne Autor, but I think the English translation is like Never Look Away. I think that's what it's called, Never Look Away. It's a beautiful and very strange movie. It's hella long. It's like 3 hours long. It probably could have stood to be less, quite so long, but it tracks this painter artist kind of through some of his life, and like the opening scene is this his elder sister, like he's like maybe 6 or something, and his elder sister is taking him to this exhibit of like perverted art. This is a real historical event that happened like in Nazi Germany, they looked at properly speaking modernist art, like the post World War I response to the horrors of World War I, and the shifts that happened in the artistic world. So like Die Brücke, this group, art group out of Dresden and stuff, and like Egon Schiele and like all these, well, Schiele's before World War One, but anyway, all these sort of like weird and like modernist artists and stuff were the Nazis said that they were and touted they were like corrupt and perverted and like disgusting. And so they had these exhibits that I don't know if they traveled or what, but of like this perverted art. And it would show as an interesting idea. Like they would have these exhibitions of perverted art then they would explain why it was disgusting, like why it was bad for the people and why it was bad for the morality. And then they would pair it with like works that were considered to be like good for the people and all this kind of stuff. So like it's interesting. So you start with this idea that, okay, well, these modernists, like the Nazis despised and killed and burned a lot of their paintings and stuff like that. And then it flashes forward, but he lives in Dresden, and like so he's in Eastern, what becomes Eastern Germany, under Soviet control, and then like becomes like a Soviet realist painter because he's a very talented artist, and so like spends this like the middle act of the movie as like a Soviet realist painter, and then like he escapes, and goes to Berlin, I think, or the West Berlin, or maybe not West Berlin, but anyway, he goes to Western Germany, and then spends the rest, like the third act, like the rest of the movie, trying to figure out like how to be an artist when he is like no longer. He's a really, really, really talented realist painter, and the only realist painting that he knows is socialist realism. And then like he can't do that anymore because now he's in the West, and he doesn't want to do it anymore because he was sort of corrupt and stagnant, but then like what does he do? And it's a cool kind of exploration of all of these things about like like how do you begin to understand and unpack these things, like, but all along, of course, like the government is just a different government is sponsoring him all along, and
he's
like
just sort of changing hands from world power to world power, and each one is just saying, hey, paint this particular form of propaganda that we want to put out there.
Yeah, and the thing that he settles on, I mean, in the end, when I say like a different government is sponsoring him, it's like the government sponsors a lot of art today. I mean, it's through essentially NEA grants and that kind of thing, which are yeah. So I don't know. It's an interesting idea. Like you think about a funding source. Okay, well, most people would say, well, that's just a funding source. Like I'm going to use that for however I want to use it, But this particular example, like kind of the shocking, like genuinely shocking example of like Pollock and the Action School is like, well, you think a funding source is a funding source. It's as good as anything else. They do have their own agenda, and you can have to make your own decisions about how seriously you want to take that,
But especially when the agenda of the patron acknowledges your agenda, but I mean, it would literally be like if the Church of Satan came to you, Catholic priest Father Gabriel, and said, hey, we want to give you $2.5 billion to build your dream Catholic church. We're not going to have any influence. We're just going to give you the money. But the whole reason we want to do that is because we assume that whatever you build is going to make Catholics look bad and make us look better by extent. We won't make that happen. We just assume that that's what will happen. Do you want the money? I mean, that's very kind of similar to what the government is sort of doing there in a sense.
Wow. I know a lot of churches that I think were built along that model. Like the Church of Satan went to the pastor and was like, I will give you as much money as you want. You just build the most beautiful thing you know how to do, because we know that your sense of what's most beautiful in the whole world is going to give glory to Satan. Speaking of which, I'm going to pause for a second. And I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, who is, I promise you, not actually the Church of Satan.
This is the worst transition I've ever heard, and I love it.
It's the best ever. Don't be jealous. You're going to be jealous about that transition for like forever. Because Catholic Creative Things, that's our name, Creative Things, is in fact brought to you by Catholic Creatives, which is an organization dedicated to igniting a new renaissance of faith through prayer and beauty and the creative spirit, to do which they connect and support and promote artists and innovators and makers and storytellers from across the faith. As you could expect, bringing together a whole community like that takes a lot of work, right? So we encourage you to go to support Catholic Creatives on their Patreon page, which is catholiccreatives.org/support. To do so, you can support us, the thing that we're doing, building the most beautiful church that we know how to build. Also, cool things that Catholic Creatives do, workshops and summits and resources and outreach is meant to support Catholic artists across the country. It's a beautiful way to become a patron of the arts, support people like Jacob and me who are actually trying to be artists ourselves, and then also just to help support people around who are working on that beautiful project. Also, I point your attention and your clicks and your thumbs to Catholic.Store, where you can find cool products from Catholic creative makers and artisans and artists. So by all means, head out there today. I'm not ready to be done with this, though, because
you shouldn't
there is another insane story that, so not in the world of visual art, but now in the realm of sort of literary art. There's this amazing Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's a good poet anyway, actually. I think when he won it, maybe in the 80s. Anyway, he was but he was from Poland, and he was Poland in the era when it was entirely controlled by the Soviets, or it falls to the Nazis and to the Soviets in his life, and
frying pan into the fire sort of situation.
Exactly.
For sure.
So he becomes so he's a dissident, and he has to leave the country because he's a dissident and all these things, okay, so he writes a book called The Captive Mind, which is this stunningly beautiful book analyzing not just what it's like being an intellectual or an artist in an ideological regime, but more importantly, sort of how such a regime convinces artists and intellectuals and academics to destroy themselves. And it is, I think, it's one of the most important books in the 2020s. I mean, it was written in the 1950s, but I think it is one of the most important books in the 2020s, and everyone should read it several times. And it's a painful and a beautiful book. And at the end, he says and I'm writing this in exile because in the end, I could not, for all that this is a word about how to stop your mind from being held captive and how to learn to be free. He said I can't, I had to go because my country will not let my mind be free. It's very powerful. It's incredibly beautiful. It's critically important that everyone read it right now. It was sponsored by the CIA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Why?
Because he's a dissident. He's a dissident artist against the Soviets.
And isn't that just so fascinating? They don't even care what the message is. They just care that it's not the message of their enemy.
Yeah, well, and that it was an important book, and I think it really did contribute to, in some ways, to some of the cultural movement that over the course of time led to that caused great upheaval, and importantly did give people tools to be free, and I guess this is what's funny when you think about I realize it's weird that the two examples we thought of are literally part of the exact same story, which is the CIA is going around being you some guerrillas in Central America who do not call yourself communists. We're going to give you a ton of weapons, and it's going to be insane, and you're going to kill so many people. It's going to be amazing. And then also you, Jackson Pollock, you're some sort of crazy atheist, sort of wild living alcoholic, antisocial, kind of anti-American, whatever. Abstract, highly abstract, transgressive painter. I'm gonna give you some money. You're this unbelievably brilliant, super Catholic, super devout, really courageous Polish dissident. I'm gonna give you money. Absolutely, it's like Oprah and Cars. It's like you get an aid package from the CIA, and you get an aid package from the
Where
CIA.
are we going to get the money? From the Rockefellers and from selling cocaine in black neighborhoods. Those two things.
Couldn't possibly nothing about this. You know what? If this is life, okay? If you don't like it, I don't know what to tell you. This is life, bro. So
this is art. This is how art happens.
This is how art happens. This is what an art is.
Side note, that brings us to a very important point, which is that this is the last episode ever.
This is a beautiful thing. This episode, in fact, brought to you by the Church of Satan and cocaine. So there it is. By the way, why did I bring it? Why did I say at the beginning that we are proudly sponsored by the Committee of Public Safety? It's because this is another great example of like government sponsored art and like where it goes wrong, right, wrong, question mark, wrong. Okay, so
right at the very least.
That's a very hard word. Do you know what the Committee of Public Safety is?
I do.
Okay, yeah. So for anybody who may not immediately know, this is the
should I have said I didn't know so that it would more justify your explanation? I don't know who that is. Tell me about it.
Well, why don't you mansplain that to me? I'm happy to mansplain it to you. I'm a priest. Which is
it's your whole job.
That is literally my job. Yeah, it's good.
Order
it's
of
great.
Preachers, more like order of mansplainers.
It's totally true though, which is cool. I own this, by the way. I'm not ashamed. Well, yeah. So after the French Revolution, it's the board of people who are making decisions about basically literally who lives and dies. The public safety is like the common weal of the revolutionary state that's coming into existence. It's headed by Robespierre, who's sort of this like psychopath, psycho killer,
really the Jared Leto of his day kind of a guy.
The who?
The Jared Leto of his day. Don't ask. It'll be funny for the people who get the reference. I'm not going to explain it right now.
Yeah, it's good. I'm assuming that's like a Mobius or whatever reference. It's cool. Don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't. Just don't explain. We're moving on. Anyway, the point is, there is this painter in the late 18th century, Jacques-Louis David, whom like everybody knows at least some of his paintings. So like he does his sort of most famous one in like any art history textbook is The Death of Marat. So it's a guy in a bathtub who's like just been stabbed. You're not sure if it doesn't. Yeah. So he's like drooping dead over his bathtub with a book or a message in his hand.
It's weird, but that is actually one of my favorite paintings and one of the only paintings that I can just mention by name in like conversation. I normally can say, oh yeah, like this Marie Cassatt painting or that Degas painting, but I don't always know the exact title, but I will just reference Death of Marat in casual conversation. I love it so much.
You are BFFs with Jacques-Louis David.
Mm-hmm.
David is a bro with a past. All right. David is a bro with a past. So he is a major supporter of the French Revolution when it happens. He'd been a painter before that. He was doing kind of just stuff, whatever. Major supporter of the French Revolution. He is actually like a member of the Committee of Public Safety. So he is like, and he's making art as such. I mean, he is also like legitimately sending people to the guillotine. Like he's a bit of a stone cold murderer. But the art that he makes is like quite legitimately government sponsored art. And he's doing this whole thing to try to promote a new vision of the human person that is like cast visually in, and he's one of the most celebrated and talented painters of his day. People know him and stuff. And he's using all of this to create like a new kind of like perfect humanist art. And so he does all this stuff. He designs like what he thinks should be the costumes that the new free people should wear, and these kinds of things, which look pretty trippy, by the way. But okay, so this is it. This is him. I mean, he is like BFF, actually personal friends with Robespierre, actually literally like sending people to their death at the Committee for Public Safety, all the rest, fine. He, however, outlives Robespierre, which is a little bit awkward because then when the whole like French Revolution system, like their sort of like personal like cult of rationality sort of like government thing, personality cult falls apart, here is
starts
still
to become
David.
the prolapsed butthole that it became. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like here's still David, who's still there and stuff, and he's just doing what he does. And then like along comes a spider called Napoleon, who represents a fair. It's not the polar opposite of the French Revolution, but who is this wild kind of tangent that has been enabled by the French Revolution and is pushing off of a lot of its strength and spirit, but in a wild kind of like tangent to what a bro like Robespierre would have been hoping for when he was stone cold murdering everybody he could get a hold of. So not natural friends. Not a natural person, that somebody who had been like actual personal friends with Robespierre and on the Committee for Public Safety, not somebody that you would naturally think he would support. David becomes a big supporter of Napoleon, big into Napoleon. Frankly, to be honest, David does just kind of, he knows what side is. He's a very political dude, but I think he's not. He's a political dude without principles, and
he
so
knows the way the wind is blowing, is what you're saying.
Yeah, he's just going to support whoever's active at the time, and I think that's just kind of how it is. So he becomes like also not exactly BFFs, but like Napoleon becomes a big patron of his, and now he's painting like imperial. He's designing a new kind of French imperial painting. So like if you have in your head any paintings of Napoleon, they are by David. And like
that's fascinating.
These are political pieces. They're political statements about like that. You know what I said, guys? I don't know. Some people might remember this really embarrassing period I had like 20 years ago when I painted the death of Marat, and like which is he was personal friends with Marat. He's mourning Marat's death. Like somebody had come in and presented him with a fake list of people that Marat was in the act of like approving to be murdered by the Committee of Public Safety, guillotine. And then she stabs him in his bath. Basically to prevent that from happening. David is not saying like, oh, isn't this terrible? He was about to send people to his death. David says like, this great hero of the people has been murdered, before he could like execute the people's justice, So like, remember that period? I hope you don't, because like it was just a phase. And anyway, that guy
it's sort of like that period's equivalent of the modern YouTube Twitter apology, where it's like, I've done a lot of thinking and growing since then, and I would like to think I'm a different person than I am now. So I will be giving a donation of $10,000 to the Napoleon Bonaparte Fund. And I hope that you will just give me time to continue thinking and growing as a person. Thank you so much. We are just all learning.
Yeah, it's like he had this moment, like when Will Smith released that after the slap, released that photograph of himself in like Buddhist meditation posture in front of the Taj Mahal. Ask no questions about that little nugget of cultural appropriation.
This might be our saltiest episode. I'm just looking back at some of the comments and disses we've made here. And this might be by far our saltiest episode.
It's amazing. It's like that. Exactly. Like when it's like, I have learned, ladies and gentlemen, I have learned, this is so like David has the same kind of thing, that he's like, I have awoken, and Napoleon has made me realize that like, actually, we just need to conquer all of like Western Europe and some of Eastern Europe. It'll be great. But again, like he's not just a fanboy, like he's getting commissions, right? Like this is all along the way. This is all commissioned art by the government. It's just that the government keeps changing, and David's style is changing a little bit, but not that dramatically. It's just what he's saying in the pieces keeps changing, because
what's most interesting to me about everything you're talking about here, in juxtaposition to a lot of my favorite examples, is that, and maybe you'll correct me here, but it seems like a lot of the cultures you're talking about already believe on some level that there is a value good to art. And it's about finding artists that can support my values and my agenda in the way I want to control my people. But I'm taking sort of just for granted the fact that art is important. And you juxtapose that with a lot of my favorite examples in the American story, the ones I've already brought up and the ones I hope I'll get a chance to bring up. And these are not groups that really give two shits about art or think that art is important at all. They're much more utilitarian, where a Robespierre or a Bonaparte have wildly different viewpoints, but both assume that art is important and they have that in common. The CIA does not necessarily uphold art as valuable. They just know that their enemies don't like a specific type of art. So they're just going to do that in the sort of way that a teenager says, well, my parent doesn't like this. I don't have any strong opinion of it, but guess now I'm the biggest fan of it in the world to piss my parents off. And I mean, my other favorite example is like Nixon ends up becoming, and maybe this is a good pivot into that, but Nixon, like not famously a super aesthetic dude by any stretch of the imagination, doesn't really care about art, ends up being kind of the most important thing to happen to American graphic design
really
in the history of the country. Purely because like people kind of convince him that it would be a good idea in order to assert control over the people and kind of promote positive feelings about the government. But they have to, in order to get their work out there, they have to convince the world leader or the CIA or whatever it is that art is important first, where I don't feel like David has to do that, for instance. He's already operating with the privilege of the fact that his potential patrons at least acknowledge the importance of art. They don't have to be sold on art first.
Yeah,
and that to me is kind of
art.
fascinating.
That is, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I think, I do think you undersell the CIA's sense of the importance of art. I mean, they're clearly not valuing, we could say, art for art's sake. But that is only one school of appreciation of art and its importance. And I think actually to the contrary, that these men were brilliantly aware of the power and importance of art in the human experience. And were paying close attention to things like this because they knew its power. Mm-hmm. Again, we can say like, boy, that doesn't seem like a very pure notion of art if it's going to be used for these kinds of purposes. But again, I mean, patrons of patrons, they almost always got agendas. Again, I'm not saying this is the best thing on the planet, but like, I just submit in contrary to that like, actually, I think these guys had a very keen sense of its importance, where like in the present moment, I might say, that it would very much surprise me if like the NSA or the CIA were like supporting a kind of dissident art movement in the United States. I would be like shocked by that. But I think the reason I would be shocked by that is in large part, it's just because of the like, I would say it's the kind of problem of pluralism played out at the level of artistic creation, where like this is just an essential problematic. It doesn't mean it's wrong per se, but it's a problematic. So like it's a condition of difficulty in which a sort of society constructed like the American society always has to deal with, which is like, on principle, we're committed to giving people the ability to be able to like pursue things in the way that they want to pursue them within circumscribed limits, whatever. And so like, since there's this pluralistic sense of like, I mean, this is like from the very beginning, America freaked out Western Europeans because it was committed to this like essentially pluralistic notion of religion, that like you pursue this the way that you're going to pursue it, and there it is. And like now the same, we have this dramatically similar thing on a bigger, maybe just a different kind of scale, where they're so far from being one normative kind of art or one normative style of art that it's so highly super pluralistic that no one kind of art or medium of art is able to like have that kind of strength, The only exception to that I might say would be filmmaking. So like if I were in a secret society or a secret agency right now and I wanted to get a message across, it would be like absolutely effortless to think that like obviously the first place I should do that would be like making a movie or making a big budget TV show, because those are not confronted with the problem of pluralism in the same way as like visual arts and stuff are.
Right. I mean, it's this is not conspiratorial at all. It is very public knowledge. The Bush administration put just a metric ass ton of money into Hollywood to promote patriotic war films after 9/11, to kind of drum up support for the.
Are you trying to tell me that's what happened to Die Hard 4?
Yeah. No, I mean like that. I mean that's kind of an observable reality. But what I'm more fascinated by is the super subtle stuff, where because and I guess why I'm fascinated by this is, as an illustrator and a graphic designer myself, I often have to convince a client that the art is worth it, that it's going to matter.
Sure.
So like someone will get in touch with me and they'll say, I want a logo. I want a logo for my company. And I say, okay, well, you should really have what's called a branding guide, which is sort of a Bible of how to use your logo and associated branding elements. So I'm going to choose fonts for you, and I'm going to choose a color palette for you to use on all of your marketing materials. And I'm going to choose like examples of the kind of photography you want to use, and even examples of the kind of photography you don't want to use based on who your target demographic is. And I'm going to establish like all of these things in this book, and I'm going to give it to you. And they will inevitably always say, no, I would rather just pay you a much smaller amount and just get the logo. And it's at that point that I have to do a tremendous amount of education work where I'm basically not trying to upsell because I want to make extra money off of it, because quite frankly, it's a lot more work to do the branding guide, and it's pretty quick to do a logo for a company that doesn't care. But rather because I want the company to know like, hey, people are going to, whether they consciously register it or not, reverberate a heck of a lot better with your mission and what you're trying to do if everything is uniformly aesthetically consistent, and actually is maybe even presenting a unspoken worldview via those aesthetics. And that becomes a very difficult conversation to have. And I tend to be pretty good at explaining it and getting people to kind of sign up for the full thing, but it is always the hardest part of the job. And then when I imagine you having to do that for a whole government body, that becomes fascinating to me. And so you had made kind of the crack at the beginning about the beard graphic that went out, pre-pandemic. And the graphic art thing is the hardest part to sell. And this brings me to the Nixon example that I brought up before. So, Nixon is obviously not a popular fella in the polls, even before any of the scandals. And two people become really responsible for a lot of the design we take for granted now as being like the coolest design America has ever produced. It's all because these two people kind of convinced Nixon that he needed to do it in order to sell people on some of the programs that he was trying to get going.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
So this guy, Leonard Garment, and then
let me guess. I'm going to guess first before you tell me. I'm going to say, this is the origin story of Comic Sans.
I don't think that it is. It might be. I don't know.
Damn.
I don't know enough about the origins of Comic Sans. I know that Comic Sans is really, really useful for dyslexic people because it breaks all the rules of traditional font. And so it's harder for the brain to fudge it. So there is actually a practical use for Comic Sans, but that's the only thing I know about Comic Sans. What I do know about this movement, though, was that all the really cool shit. So I'm talking the National Parks logo. I'm talking about NASA. Right? Like that classic, awesome NASA logo that's on t-shirts and stuff even now. I'm talking about like establishing a common visual language for signage. Like what are bathroom signs look like everywhere? What a telephone booth signs look like everywhere. What really? A highway. All of that stuff happens under Nixon because these two people, Leonard Garment, who's a liberal advisor to him, and then Nancy Hanks, who ends up becoming the president or I don't forget what it's called, like the leader of the NEA, the National Education Administration. And they convince Nixon, like, hey, you're going to need to sell people who don't agree with you politically on different bills and different movements, funding for NASA, funding for national parks, funding for this and that. You're going to have a heck of a lot easier time if you flush a frankly unprecedented amount of money into the NEA so that we can just hire the greatest graphic designers in the world to come up with a common visual language for America. And Nancy Hanks specifically says, we want to rebrand what government is. We want to fundamentally change how people visually and aesthetically perceive government. They end up raising under Nixon the budget of the NEA from, I want to get this right, from 15 million to 40 million.
Okay.
And they do. I mean, they bring in some really, really, really incredible people to do everything from the NASA logo and the National Park Service and all stuff to just if we take for granted even now, like phone signs and things like this. All of that is established under this group. And then I mentioned the idea of a branding guide and like selling a client on a branding guide. What does that look like when you build it for the entire government? It looks like this huge Bible they made. I'm trying to called Design Necessity, which published in 1973. And it's this, I'm going to quote, a compendium about federally initiated visual communications, landscape architecture, industrial design, interior design, and architectural projects intended to underscore how design can improve government. And they put everything in there from like how IRS stuff should be laid out. They put how the National Park Service might use something called a mini folder to reduce how much they have to print maps and other brochures on like bear safety and reduce that down to a more aesthetically pleasing souvenir booklet. Like all of these things are like literally like 10,000 different designers are coming in under the Nixon administration to fundamentally rethink what we consider like America, like all the aesthetics of America. And they do basically this ushers in what's considered even now to be the golden age of graphic design. I mean, the golden age of graphic design was like 1973 to like 1985. And it was exclusively because of this. And then Reagan comes in and says, we're spending how much? And shuts
graphic to what?
Everything down. And that's, and so like the IRS, everything looks like crap now. And like, it's all bad. But like people will recently, like within the last 5 years, like people crowdfunded to get a publicly released version of the original NASA branding guide that was designed by these people. Cause it's just so beautiful that people just wanted to have it as like a coffee table book. I mean, these people really did. And I'm kind of fascinated. There's a Canadian vlogger I watch who does videos on American history as it's actually unfolding. So like current news things as they're going to be seen, 25, 30 years down the road based on how we have retold events from 30 years ago. So it's really insightful. And he does a lot of videos on like what actually is American culture, because so many Americans take their culture for granted and don't even think about like, oh yeah, I guess that is a fundamental aspect of American identity. And things like phone signs and bathroom signs and stamps and stuff like this are absolutely the stuff that we don't intuit. But if they weren't there, we would absolutely notice their absence and something fundamental about the American identity would be gone. And it was all created by these two people under Nixon.
Right. Yeah. It's how you experience it. I mean, I remember the first time I like really left the country, I was moving to Japan for a year and I'm like by myself, and like I speak Japanese somewhat at this point, but still like it's a whole big thing. I'd never really been anywhere other than like Canada before. And I just, I say that's not a big deal because I grew up like a 2-hour drive from the Canadian border. So this is just not that exciting, and it's, so, okay, so big things are like I land in Japan and I still remember really, really, really keenly, like the first thing that caught my eye was like the exit sign because the exit sign they use looks like the American exit sign is like, "Attention, sir. The egress is this way." You know, there's this like very staid kind of like loopy, guy with guy with sort of like soft loopy legs, sort of like walking sedately towards a door that is attractive in its own right. The door is comfortable with itself. He's comfortable with himself. They will meet someday, and that's perfectly fine. The Japanese escape sign, if I could be a little bit stereotypical about it, the exit sign, I should say, is basically, it's like, Godzilla, everybody, run away. Because
you're allowed to be stereotypical when you actually speak the language.
I think so. I've always believed this. Because he is running full tilt, like in a panic towards the door.
But as a graphic designer, like, that's so cool and fascinating, because what that means is that a group of people sat in a room somewhere in America, probably between 1973 and 1980, and said, hey, we want to create an exit sign that inspires a sense of calm.
Yeah.
Because we don't want people fleeing too quickly, but we also want to be very directive because we don't want people to be confused at all. And we're going to create a visual language that is uniformly applied through an entire country. And like, that to me is how most people feel when they see a huge act of like civil engineering, right? Because it is like pulling teeth for me to convince like a taco truck that hired me to do their logo I use the example because I've never done a taco truck, so none of my clients listening right now can get offended by me like speaking about them opaquely, but like it's like pulling teeth for me to get the taco truck that I brand to even use the font that I suggested for them across their menu without just switching arbitrarily to Times New Roman because it was what was easily available. You know what I mean? And the idea,
and you were saying, bro, use papyrus. It's just right there, bro. You're a restaurant. Use papyrus. It was made
Shout out
for
to
you.
Chris Costello. Shout out to Chris Costello.
Hashtag.
But the idea of designers convincing an entire country across different political parties, across state lines, states that hate each other, to say, hey, we should probably all use the same exit sign. Like, the salesmanship of that, to me, that is what graphic design is all about. And I'm genuinely we started this episode talking about looking at things sincerely rather than ironically. I am unironically actually moved by the accomplishment that was the golden age of design under Nixon.
That's so glorious. There's this constitution of the city of Siena at the beginning of the 14th century that says,
jumping back just a little bit,
whoever rules the city must have the beauty of the city as his foremost preoccupation.
Oh God.
And
Can
I
get
think
that tattooed. I want that tattooed on my body somewhere.
It keeps the thing keeps going, so you would be welcome to have it tattooed. Just depends. Just pick, back or forehead. Is depends like how much of it you can put. But
Right.
But it's a powerful idea that like that's what it means to be a ruler of and like what good government means. We've given like these wild examples. Some of them that produce things that are strange. Some of them that produce things that are really beautiful. Other times where it's like hard to see the connection, like why the government would want to sponsor this. And like we can see, sure, like as for the individual artist, this can be like unprincipled complicity with whatever way the wind is blowing. It can be like simply not caring where your money's coming from as long as you get the money. It can be active awareness and agreement with the principles of the person who's giving you the funds, whatever. I mean, it can be all these things. Like, it doesn't make you good or evil, and it doesn't make the artwork good or bad. It's just that it creates these really complex relationships. But like, I just think that this is you were saying like there's this hard sell to even like get the government to care this much. But I think this is like, I mean, this is a vision that either like, and I mean this genuinely, like either lives in the heart of the people or it doesn't live at all. That like whoever rules the city must have the beauty of the city as his foremost preoccupation. So for you, for us, you know, for all you listening out there, you may not personally own a city, you may not personally run a government, but honestly, these things, like they either live in your heart or they don't live anywhere at all. So I tell you, happy Independence Day. Go forth, create cool things.
You've been listening to Creative Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives, hosted by Father Gabriel Toretta OP and Jacob Flores Popchek, produced by Jessica Flores Popchek and Kyle Meineke. To find out more about how you can support the podcast and other ventures for artists, visit catholiccreatives.org/support.